Hey everyone, it's the Eclectic Handyman. Today we're going to take weathered deck boards like these or newly placed down deck boards like these and put down Rust-oleum 20X paint and primer to give them a protective coating like this. Let's see how it's done. To begin, let's talk about the products involved in using the ROCKSOLID Deck Resurfacer 20X paint, which is a very, very thick paint that goes on top of our wood deck, either old deck boards or new deck boards. It creates this coarse texture. It can fill in cracks if you're doing it on an old deck. It's not exactly a Trex decking, but for a lot less cost, you get almost like an armor guard on top of the deck. I've become a big fan of this when done right. So let's talk about the process from start to finish. We'll start with the deck and patio cleaner. I'm going to use a pressure washer. If you don't have one, but you've got a broom and a hose, that will work just fine. You need to get the loose dirt up and have a good clean surface. Next, we'll go ahead and do the primer. This is a key step. One of these gallons goes really far compared to the actual paint itself. We'll get this primer down. That'll create a nice bonding surface for ultimately using the Resurfacer paint itself. Now, the Resurfacer paint does use a special roller. You can pick that up as well. It's got these, coarse texture to it that allows soaking up this paint, which is, again, a specialty paint for the deck. So we'll need one of those as well. Now, you can do this in a day. The timeline would be early in the morning. You clean the deck. About an hour later, you can prime the deck. And 2 to 3 hours later, you can paint the deck. I prefer to do it on, say, a Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Maybe on Thursday, I will clean the deck. On the Friday, I will prime the deck. And on a Saturday, I'll paint the deck. Just know you can do it in one day if you want, or you can spread it out if time allows it to do so. The only tricky part I found about this project from acquiring these items is the first two I could get online pretty easily or at the big box stores like Lowe's. The Deck Resurfacer paint itself is only available from 2 retailers that I'm aware about. That's Menards and Home Depot. Neither of them carry it in stock. I usually get mine from Menards. I do have to pay for shipping, but once you're in the system, I think it's a negligible cost in order to have the protection of what this ends up looking like. Quick mention, in the same product line, they make a 6X paint. Now, I've used this one before. I don't like it as much. It doesn't have like the anti-skid coarse properties that the 20X has. To me, it's just a really, really thick latex paint that even when it gets wet or it's rained, it becomes slippery. And then you end up having to add the anti-skid into the paint to try to basically make it with the 20X. If you're doing it to old deck boards, it doesn't fill the cracks and imperfections as well. So I'm not as much of a fan as this. So just wanted to mention that if you're thinking about it, but we'll be using the 20X. Other than that, you don't need anything real sophisticated. We'll just need a paint roller. We've got the brush. You'll need a paint tray, some rags to clean up, and away we go. All right, let's get started with step 1 and cleaning the deck. Just use a little bit of it. It'll help get any of the dirt. You know, since these boards were newly put down, there's not a lot to clean off anyway. So if you just have water, you're good to go. Get the pressure washer fired up and clean those deck boards. All right, pressure washing's done. I typically do like to plan this that I do it over 3 days, even though you can do it in a day. I do this at the evening, one evening, prime the next day, and paint on the 3rd day. But remember, you can do deck in a day if you need to. But if you got like a Thursday, Friday, Saturday with good weather, that can make it easy as well. All right, we will let this dry overnight, and then we'll prime the boards tomorrow.
A few moments later.
The first prep step that we need to do before we actually put down the primer, whether you waited for the boards to dry overnight or they've just been a few hours and you're doing the deck in the day method, is to go ahead and take a push broom or a leaf blower and clean off any debris before we start to paint. And then we'll be ready to lay down the primer. One optional step that you may want to do is use some painter's tape to mask off any doors or siding where you're going to be painting up against that might be a different color just to make it easier. So just take that painter's tape and get it prepared so that it'll be easier to brush the paint on. All right, we're ready to get started with our rock solid deck primer. Now, one thing to keep in mind about 1 gallon of this will cover 450 square feet, whereas the actual paint, 1 gallon covers around only 40 square feet. So for every 10 buckets of paint, you only need 1 bucket of primer. This stuff will go a lot longer than the paint will. What I'm going to do is start with just either a foam brush or a paintbrush. I'm going to go around the trim because we're going to use a roller here in a minute, and this will help it so we don't have to get that roller right up against the doors or the house. If you don't have that issue, you can go straight to using a roller. All right, let's go ahead and get this done, and then we'll move on to pouring out into a paint tray and use our roller. Once you're ready to use the roller for the primer, all you're going to need is something to put it in. When you use these liners, especially with this more industrious type paint, I like to take a couple of pieces of painter tape and tape the liner to this. It just helps with using a roller. You're going to need a 3/8 inch or close to that nap roller to put it on. That'll be good, a roller. And you could do this by hand if needed, but if you have like a broom brush or pole that these will attach to, that will be quite useful and a bit easier to do. This process can be done technically within 30 minutes after pressure washing, so you can put it down again when it's wet. But if you had let it dry, that's fine too. So again, after the trim is done and it's dried for at least 30 minutes, you can go ahead and start with the primer. Let's get this poured in here and start applying. So when apply using the roller, just make sure you get the entire thing saturated. This will end up being applied as kind of like a glue-like look to it, but do not worry because it does dry clear, and we're going to be painting on top of it anyway. And so just make sure that you just go a few feet at a time and then go back and forth and keep reapplying. Once that roller, especially when it's new, gets fully saturated, it'll be the same thing with the paint. It'll continue to glide on with ease. Make sure that you put a good, decent amount on there. We don't want to skimp on this because this is really the bond that the paint will adhere to. If you ever paint a deck without priming it, it will be susceptible to having that paint come right back off. So that's something I didn't mention. Can I just go straight to the paint? You really do need to do the primer. And as I mentioned, the bucket goes 450 square feet, so you're going to get a lot out of that. I paid about $45 for that paint can. So continue doing this process until it's all done. And then we will need to let this dry for about 2 to 3 hours at minimum before we put the paint. In my situation, I'm going to go ahead and let this dry overnight because again, I have several nice days in a row and I just have the luxury of letting that dry. So that's all there is to it. Continue on, overlapping, apply that primer. Again, it will dry clear and we'll be ready to paint.
A few moments later.
All right, so it's the next day. Our primer has had plenty of time to dry, and it is time to use the Deck Resurfacer 20X. Now, for whatever you know about painting, if you've never used something like this before, all rules are out. This stuff is super, super thick, and so the way it gets applied with this specialty roller, which we are now ready to use, is a little bit different as far as the technique. So one of the things that you'll want to do is, again, go ahead and put that roller on there. And it's got, you know, all these brushes on it that are thick so that the paint can soak up into here. You're also going to want a damp rag. This stuff does splatter. The technique you want to use is to go slow and don't apply too much pressure. You can be liberal with it and let it coat the deck or old wood surface or new wood surface. It doesn't matter. And I should probably highlight, if you're doing an older wood surface and you're filling in cracks, the process will be the same that you're doing with this, but you want to make sure that you take your time putting this on. The other thing is, you can tell I'm in the shade. I prefer to do this step in the evening. I have put this down in the middle of the day, in the bright sun. It's not impossible, but like any paint, it does dry very quickly. So as you're trying to overlap, it doesn't give much forgiveness and it gets tacky really quickly. I did that last time, I didn't like it. So I'm doing this in the evening. Actually, all these steps I can do in the evening: pressure washing, priming, and painting. One other tip, while I'm pouring this in here, it's ideal if you get it ordered and stirred at the hardware store, or if you're ordering online like I did with Menards, and use that paint as quickly as possible within a few days, because then you don't have to stir it by hand as much, because again, this stuff is very messy and it's difficult to stir with the paint stick because it is so thick. So if you can use it within a few days of receiving it or having it stirred with one of those paint shakers at the hardware store, that is the ideal scenario. All right, so when the roller is new, it's going to take it just a minute to get saturated, but by the end of the day, it'll be fully submerged in this very thick paint. And then again, the way to put this on, go very slowly, because you don't want it to splatter on doors and places that you don't intend it to go. Now don't worry, like I said, this is because the roller is not fully saturated yet. But as you can see, and see that texture that it's putting on right there? That's part of this roller specialty as well. So each time that you put it in, and you want to keep just, this maybe is one technique that you would keep from any normal painting project, is to keep that wet edge. So that's why you only want to do small sections at a time as you apply this. Now when you do the edges, you can't use this roller, so it won't have that texture. So you want to try to get the roller as close as possible so that you can have that texture style all the way through. And again, I'm going to be going over this a few times here to make sure that I get plenty of paint down in these cracks. This always happens when you first start using this. Again, when you're working with this tray down here, make sure to really go slowly. This stuff starts going all over the place. I'm just applying a bit of pressure here. I'm going over and over. Now you can start to see, and then I can flip the roller over when I need to be close to the edge here. Luckily for me, my siding is basically the exact same color, so if I hit the side, I'm not going to get penalized like probably 99% of folks that have a different color house. I can see this thing just throwing little bits of paint as I move the roller, so it's really important to go slow. Also, you might notice here that I'm in the season where leaves are falling, so I do have my blower handy to keep the deck clean while I'm doing this process. So keep that in mind depending on the time of the year that you're doing this project, that again, keeping the deck clean for the time period while you need to paint. The good news is it does begin to dry rather quickly. Not necessarily to step on the day of, but you can get this dry and it won't. So if a leaf falls on it a few hours after going on, especially with the texture anyway, or a small stick or something, it's not going to be a big deal. A couple of other quick tips. You might want to keep something like this, like a broken stick or something that you can edge, so that if you want to keep the interior clean, you can run it down through. Now eventually what I'll do is on a second day, I'll probably go through with a brush so that I have consistent paint down in the cracks. As the day goes along and I'm painting more and more and that brush gets more and more saturated, it will continue to fill in some of that, but you may want to have something like this handy as well. Also important to mention, well, there we go. One of the things about that is it says on the can 40 square feet. Now I know inside the house when you get a can of paint for walls and stuff, depending on what color you're painting over, whatever, you can get a lot more out of a can than the manufacturer dictates. I have found this to be exactly about 40 feet if you do it right. So do the math, measure your square footage, see how many cans you're going to need, You know, it might be a few $100 investment depending on the size of the area that you are painting. But again, nothing in comparison to like a Trex deck or something like that. And so you get that nice protected deck. This stuff is like a coat of armor, like I said at the beginning. And what I like to do before I go back over for the fine touches is, again, just go through and pull those lines just for any extra. And some of it running down through is not a bad thing, protecting all parts of the deck. And last but not least, I go over it while it's still wet, just like you would if you were painting a wall, to give it that consistent texture before we go on to the next row. And then I'll lightly pick up the roller. And there we have it. Look how awesome that looks. So we're going to continue on section by section until we are done. So let's go ahead and continue on and see how it looks when we're done.
Much later.
All right, so there we have it. The deck has dried. I've waited a couple of days. They recommend about 6 hours to the touch, a day or two before walking on, and really 7 days before you put furniture or patio furniture or grills back on this. We've got that anti-skid coarse nature. We've literally probably added about 1/8 of an inch of texture to the top of these boards, which makes it have, like, again, this armor protection. Really, really pleased with the outcome. Finished a little bit later than I expected. It was kind of getting into the nighttime and dark, but no problem. I had lighting. The only thing I'm going to do from here is maybe come back with a brush and go in between the boards where the roller couldn't get the paint down in there, but that's an optional step. If you see it at an angle, you can just kind of dab it down in there with any leftover paint you have. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm very pleased with this. I've done my entire deck, and again, whether they're new deck boards or old deck boards like that you're just resurfacing to preserve the life of them, this stuff is a great investment. If you like this, give it a thumbs up. Let me know what you think. Check out the other videos on the channel. Until next time, this is the Eclectic Candyman. We'll see you later.